I haven't always been a runner. Despite my last name, I've never been faster coordinated. I started running when I got a job as an art professor at a small college in Iowa. The year I was up for tenure, I had to do something with my body that didn't involve my hobby, which I affectionately called preemptive worry. I started training for a half marathon. Iowa is a perfect place to learn to run. The state has low elevation gains and hundreds of miles of rural county highways. I started to think of my long training runs as therapy. Logging miles along endless corridors of field corn stilled my frantic mind and refocused my breath. The first time I was run off the road, it was dusk in late September. I had just passed a four-way intersection just outside of town, and a pickup truck with two young white men in the cab pulled up close to me. I could smell the heat of their tires as they pulled up close into the gravel, just far enough to push me over the edge of the road. In my mind, I can hear them laughing as I tumbled over the shoulder into the place I now know the Department of Transportation calls the verge. I fell because I was pushed, but also because the grade is very steep. This grade is functional, designed for any vehicle that goes over the edge to pull back onto the road. It's also a space designed to make a boundary. It holds banks of plowed snow, electrical infrastructure, and the residue of car accidents. Crouching in the sharp stubble of crabgrass, I was shaking with anger. I could feel the adrenaline of the run and the rage at the pickup drivers. I tried to still the heartbeat in my ears as I listened for the truck's return. As the sun continued to set and the silence deepened, I began to assess the road rash on my hip and knee as I began to jog towards home. In 6 weeks, I finished the race. In the months that followed, I couldn't stop noticing the verge. What was this space, this non-space, between every road and field? I now know this same space exists at every road in the country. In fact, it is the longest contiguous wild space in the US. This was the time I started counting the deer. As an artist, I've taught a lot of drawing classes, and one of the things I teach beginning students is that learning to draw isn't really about learning to draw. It's about learning to see. In fact, I think this is the greatest skill art can teach us. More than rendering a perfect object or building a symmetric form, art teaches us to focus and pay attention. Drawing is also a tool for building empathy. Often one of the most powerful experiences for a beginning student is being in the studio with a live model. Even the most cynical of us are hardwired to understand the privilege of this experience. When there is a body in the room for us to observe and learn from, we automatically understand this is someone's child or someone's parent. We also learn to draw from the inside out. I begin all drawings with the line of the jaw, the seventh cervical of the spine, the line of the pelvis, to anchor the figure in the space of the page. The thing about seeing in this way is that once something's seen, it can't be unseen. I couldn't unsee the verge. And it was as though my eyes had a deer filter on them. I saw white ribs poking through a stand of grass. Was that a trash bag caught on a fence? I pulled over to find a deer body crumpled and dry. The postures these bodies held in death reminded me of Renaissance paintings. They were so human and emotional, heads thrown back in moments of ecstasy. Some of them looked like saints, their legs tangled, chests forward, mouths open. There were so many of them, and their deaths were so brutal. How could I count two within a quarter mile of each other on opposite sides of the road? How were there 10 within the 5-mile loop I was running just outside my small town? The author C.J. Hauser writes in her beautiful piece, The Crane Wife, if you want to save a species, you don't spend your time staring at the bird you want to save. You look at what it relies on to live instead. You ask if there's enough here to eat. Is there enough to drink? Is there enough here to survive? Surrounding my small town and in much of rural America is an agricultural monoculture. Feed corn is the primary crop. This crop has been genetically modified to push out all other crops and native plants, often called weeds. This feed corn isn't raised to feed us, but instead to fuel our vehicles and feed the animals butchered for us: cows, chickens, cows, chickens, and pigs. It also feeds the deer. These large ungulates, whitetails in the east and Midwest, and mule deer as the population pushes westward, are close relatives of antelope, elk, and moose. They were once such a valuable food source in our country that they were nearly hunted to extinction in the 1800s. I have met century farmers in Iowa whose grandparents had deer pastures on their land. These sections of farm were put aside from crop rotation to support a breeding pair of whitetails to repopulate a species we nearly lost. Deer are such an important symbol of American wildness that some of their fiercest protectors are the hunting community. This constituency works tirelessly for the preservation of wild land to save places for prey. I learned that deer are synanthropes. This word describes an anomaly in our time of species loss. These animals have adapted to thrive in our human-centered landscape. Other synanthropes include urban scavengers like rats, pigeons, and raccoons. Deer are some of the largest. In fact, they are as large as us. Deer are found everywhere there are people, from Staten Island to Wyoming. But they thrive in edge landscapes, the space between cities and agriculture, that same suburban sprawl where our own families grow. In this landscape, deer can gorge in the fields during the day and bed down in your manicured lawn at night. In this ideal landscape, a deer population can double in just a couple of years. When I started to see the scope of the roadkill deer, I wanted to get close to these bodies. I was curious about them for so many reasons. Their spine is the same length as mine, and I felt a kinship there. But I was also fascinated by how closely we used to live with them. I spent a lot of time in archives, and up until the 1940s, there are always bone tools, buttons, adornments, and instruments. Now these same bones lie in the verge, interspersed with the trash of broken vehicles. How have we gotten so far away from these animals that are so like us that they thrive in our habitat? I started talking to friends, land managers, hunters, farmers, and eventually county sheriffs. How could I move these bodies to safety and work with their bones in sculpture? If a deer is recently killed, I move the body to a site at a restored prairie. Lifting these 110-pound bodies into a vehicle, I could be carrying an adolescent or myself. When I get to the prairie, I lay the deer down under chicken wire for a season. This prevents scavengers from taking away the bones and also allows the insects to do the good work of cleaning them. If I find a clean skeleton in the verge, it often rests in a bed of hair. This is a reminder to me that they are mammals like us. But the hair also feels like a memento, a braid held in a locket after a loved one has died. Once I bring the bones to the studio, I begin a process I affectionately call bone laundry. Here I soak the bones in cycles of warm water and dish soap, removing all the grease from them. I then scrub them clean and soak them in cycles of peroxide and lay them out to dry in the sun. This process harkens to a long tradition of women's work, which often involves cleaning, organizing, and sterilizing. Once the bones are clean, I can assess the damage to the skeleton. What vehicle broke all the ribs? What animal took the whole left leg? Was it a raccoon that gnawed the shoulder blade before drawing off the whole right leg? Working with wax replicas of each bone, I begin repair. I fit the wax element exactly to the bone. I then cast the wax piece in glass and fuse the glass and bone together, marking the space of repair with a thin layer of white gold. I then re-articulate the skeletons and suspend them in a gallery, this time standing on 2 legs, where the animals can stand, repaired, shoulder to shoulder, with us. Why engage in this laborious act of repair? These deer have already died. This violence has already occurred. I do this to build empathy in the space of an exhibition. By my seeing of these animals, I ask that others see them too. Together we can ask the question, what violence do we accept? What violence do we see as ordinary? What other beings do we extinguish in public and walk away? I have never hit a deer. I have had many strangers in exhibitions come to me and tell me stories of deer strikes. The terrifying thud of a 100-pound body leaping into the passenger side of a vehicle, causing the driver to careen out of control. People tell me of seeing the flash of eyes in the headlights moments before a body collides with a windshield, shattering the glass and obliterating the driver's view with blood and fur. People tell me they don't remember exiting their vehicle, just standing or crouching in the verge, shaking. One woman told me of collapsing next to a doe she had struck, holding the giant head of the animal in her lap as she wept. I have never hit a deer, but I have had my windshield shatter. Many years ago, a man that I loved shattered the windshield of our vehicle while I was driving on a highway. My windshield shattered from inside my car. This was only one instance in a chain of violence. It took me many years to see, and even more years to leave. I have never hit a deer, but I know the terror of having your vision obscured by shattered glass. I know the terror of pulling over while crying out. I know opening the driver's door, thighs quaking, the wind burning your tear-stained cheeks. I know I didn't have a coat on. I know I pleaded with him as he crossed from the passenger to the driver's side, closed the door, and drove away. I stood alone in the verge for a long time. I know that many, many cars drove by, and no one stopped. Why devote my life to working with these bones found in the verge? First, I ask that we learn to see this wild space. Here, where I collect deer remains, I also find wildflowers and native grasses. There's abandoned trash and invasive species, but also flocks of turkeys and rabbit nests. Wild space is so precious and so rare. Here in Nebraska, less than 2% of our land is wild. If we think of cities as only parks and concrete, and we think of rural spaces as industrial farms, what does that leave for other kinds of wild space? Wildlife refuge implies that wildlife is existing without us. We now know that is not possible. Humans have impacted every element of the natural world. It took me being pushed into the verge to see this space as a possible refuge for wildlife. I work in the verge because it is a non-space, a space defined by what it isn't. I find this the perfect place to address what it means that we once hunted a species to near extinction because it is so valuable, and in the same century built a system in which deer are so unseen that we kill 3,500 a day in road accidents. I hope that we can consider the importance of what wildness in our midst presents. Animals need to be able to see our systems from the land, sky, and water. Animals need to be able to move so they can thrive. It took me being pushed into this place I see every day to see this place as a possible refuge for wildlife. Wildlife needs to be protected from us. We are in a time of cultural reckoning with all kinds of violence. What violence are we willing to accept as normal in our homes, in our schools, in our governments? Who else do we need to grant safety and safe passage to? I want to imagine a time when a woman can drive across the country at night and seeing the flash of a doe's eyes in her headlights knows that this female is walking along a fence to a wildlife corridor, all of us moving safely through the night.